You're listening to The Pain Chaser 1, Ambuscade. This audiobook contains violence, torture, drug use, and scenes of a graphic and often disturbing sexual nature. It should go without saying that it is not intended for children. Now turn up the sound, turn down the lights, and find a comfortable place to hide. Because fear has a face, and I'm going to show it to you. Chapter 11. Tabby fled from the scene in a blind panic, never looking back, leaving Rob to his fate. She would convince herself in the time that followed that the decision to do so had been one of logic, that obviously the monster that had been attacking him was too powerful for her to have been able to make a difference, and not fleeing would only have resulted in her death as well. As true as this fact was, logic had been the last thing on Tabby's mind at the time. Her own fear had been the only thing tangible to her in those moments. She sprinted recklessly, with no clear destination in mind, naked and painted in blood. Her footfalls echoed wetly in the corridors, leaving a trail of crimson footprints in her wake. She passed the library on the left, oblivious to the changes that had taken place there. Had she looked, she would have seen that the room, that less than an hour earlier had been an enormous empty breath, was now carpeted and filled with row upon row of bookshelves, choked with dusty and worn volumes, all of which had literally erupted from the floor out of nothingness. In the passage ahead, she came to a sudden stop as a disembodied voice suddenly spoke, only feet from where she currently stood. "So, you decided to come back, did you?" it asked. Tabby looked around, her fracturing mind trying to make sense of the situation, desperately looking for the origin of the voice. "They're never going to let you live, you know. Not after the shit you pulled," it added after a second. There was an odd shimmer in the air now, like summer heat rising off of blacktop. Tabby experienced a moment of vertigo as a strange ripple set everything in motion. It was as if somehow for a moment reality had become liquid, and a wave had moved through it. Then a second voice spoke, with a hiss like a rattlesnake. "I'm not here to ask the council for forgiveness," it said. "Shit, he's got a gun! Run!" the first voice yelled suddenly. "She was mine," the second voice bellowed, rising into a growl. "You had no right to take her from me! She was mine, you motherfuckers! Now you're all gonna burn!" There was a sound like a small cannon firing, and the air in front of Tabby suddenly exploded. A plume of blood and other matter burst from that central point directly at her. She brought her hands up to protect herself, but miraculously, it passed harmlessly through her as if she were made of smoke, and it showered its substantial gore in a spreading puddle on the floor behind her. Her hands fell to her sides, and she screamed. It was the scream of a woman lost on the ocean, a scream of despair, only Tabby's ocean was her mind, and the shore was getting further and further away. There was a second report, and more of the spectral blood sprayed the locker bank to her right in a long splash that ran down the metal in long rivulets. "Run!" a second voice cried with sadistic laughter in its tone. "Run away! Scuttle to your holes like the insects you love so much!" Taking the cue as if the voice had been speaking to her, she sped away, her overstressed mind already unable to deal with what she'd been through. It rejected this new development outright. Her flight coincidentally took her to the very stairwell where Annie had twisted her ankle, running from the creature earlier. Instead of heading up to the second floor, she noticed a dark alcove beneath the stairs where she could hide. She crouched inside and hugged her knees close, shivering in part from fear and in part from the cold, but mostly from shock. Her nerves had been pushed to their absolute limit. The world seemed to have turned against her. Nothing made sense anymore. What had once been a place of reason had in the span of one day completely been turned on its head. Her world was now one populated with unspeakable miscreations and impossible occurrences. She knew that if she survived this ordeal, she would never be the same person again, that she could never live a normal life. Another shudder of unreality spread over her in a wave, moving over the surface of the physical world, as if it were being strained through a membrane. She didn't even question it this time. In fact, she could actually see its baleful pattern as it spread over the surfaces in the stairwell and up to the second floor. That pattern was evident in the way that it changed things. There was even a noise that accompanied it. A low groaning, only audible in the silence of the room. She could see the new iron support bars that held up the railing along the stairs twist and shift, as if aging decades in the span of seconds, layering over with the rust and decay of time. The building was, piece by piece, changing from a newly built edifice to one that had seen a great deal of wear and tear, and where things had long since begun to break down. In short, the new Kettle Creek High School was being supplanted by the one of old, a place that had seen its share of horrors. Tabby saw all of this and none of it. Her mind focused instead on one detail. The railing support above her had come loose from its fitting when it had changed. The iron bar looked as though it could easily be pried loose from the railing, and she would have an impromptu weapon with which to defend herself. She took a tentative step out and pried loose her prize, but in that moment she noticed with dismay that a trail of vague footprints, outlined in blood, led right to her hiding spot. If the monster was following her, it would lead him right to her. Her mind reeled as she tried to think of what she should do. But the thought was short-lived as she realized with sudden terror, from a movement in her peripheral vision, that the door to the stairwell was opening, and someone was coming through. She did the only thing she could do. She scrambled back into the alcove under the stairs, and clutched the iron bar to her chest like a talisman. The creature shuffled into the room, and stopped a foot from where she hid. She imagined it was studying the footprints on the floor, and that the seconds that passed now were among the handful she had left. It need only look a foot to its left, and she would be revealed. Truthfully, it was impossible to tell where the creature was looking. Its face was so indecipherable. With one eye a ruination and the other an empty shield of glass, it could have been looking anywhere. The creature lifted its dog-like head as if sniffing the air. She clamped a hand over her mouth and quit breathing. Could it smell her? She was stung with a sudden, absurd fear that it could somehow hear her thoughts. Then suddenly, unbelievably, it was moving away. It paced slowly to the foot of the stairs and began to climb. There was a long, tense moment as the stairs above her creaked with its weight. Ancient dirt and debris sprinkled down onto her and stung her eyes. Then the door upstairs was opening, and it was gone. She began to cry. Pushed to her absolute limit, Tabby found her thoughts going back to Vanessa, her daughter. She realized that in all the time she spent in this nightmare, she'd only been thinking of herself. Vanessa and she had never had a very strong relationship, and somewhere inside herself, Tabby had always believed that there would be time to fix that. Now she was forced to face the fact that time may be running out. "I'll come home, baby," she whispered. "I promise." She gripped the bar so hard that her fingernails bit into her flesh. Anton, David, and Annie made their way slowly down the hallway. They allowed their pace to match Annie's, whose injuries forced her to favor her left foot. She still used the axe as a makeshift crutch. She knew that they were putting themselves in considerable danger to help her, but neither of them complained, and she felt a deep affection for both men. Before the ordeal that they had shared, she had regarded Anton as an eccentric. The looks he gave her, if he paid any attention at all, were disturbingly lecherous, and his obsession with the macabre had outright frightened her. She'd always seen fit to avoid him if she could, but in the past few hours, he had shown more backbone than she could have given him credit for, and she was thankful to have him there to support her. In the face of extreme opposition, he had been the first to do something to try to better their chances by studying the Book of Adumbril Verses.